Good morning. Bill here to introduce lesson 21 of our series on the apocalypse. And this week's lesson focuses on the apocalypse and how Revelation was interpreted during the colonial period. And the notes have been sent out by Bob. And after this one, we have 3 more to go with 3 more weeks. And hopefully by then we'll be able to gather together. We've got a full course prepared on the Holy Spirit. And Bob and I are working on an additional course that Ehrman has put together and the University of Bela in Waco has put together on heaven and hell and the history of heaven and hell. That'll be downstream at some point in time. I hope you all had a good Easter. It was certainly different, but we should always remember that Jesus said to us, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, you will find me. So I found it inspirational that John Luke could put together what he did with the help of his team. The music was great, the technology worked pretty well, and it was really amazing to come together with some of these tools like Zoom that we have. If you have not seen Bocelli and his music for Hope, which was at the cathedral in Milan, go Google it. It's all over the place. It's only about 20 minutes on YouTube, but it's certainly worth a listen. And as many of you know, the word Duomo is Italian for cathedral. And if you want to see more about the Duomo in Milan, there's an incredible website called Duomo di Milano, which you can pretty easily find. And it's got virtual tours of the cathedral. And some of you may remember a few years ago, we went there together and we spent some time in that incredible place. It's one of the Duomos that they're investing a lot of money in to rebuild. It was actually built in 1387, so it's 650 years old or something like that. But go see Bocelli's Music for Hope. It's pretty spectacular. In this particular lesson, Professor Costner gets into how Revelation was viewed during the colonial days. And I think the most interesting thing he will talk about is Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards was one of the revivalists who, along with Whitefield, was part of the church revival. Some people think that we're in the midst of another revival today, and I think they may be right. Edwards is also in the ancestry line of Bishop Susan. If you go back, of course, far enough to the 1700s. And he was really against the papacy. He thought the papacy in Revelation represented the Antichrist, which was pretty interesting. So as you go through the notes and as you see the video, kind of keep that in mind. And think about this whole idea of a local reformation, a new period of enlightenment, and think of it in the context of where we are today. This spiritual awakening in America happened in the early 1700s for about 50 years, 1703 to 1758. And I've even spoken to the bishop about this, saying, I think that's what we need today. And who knows, out of what we're going through now with this COVID-19, we people may find a way to come together and find a new spiritual awakening. So enjoy this. Know that Bob and I are working hard to bring you more videos. We're sending you little inspirational messages and things that you might enjoy seeing. And miss you all, and looking forward to getting together. And just remember, at any point in time, if any of you want to chat, outside of all the folks I'm calling, just give me a buzz and we can chat. Thanks very much, and God bless you all.
Welcome back to this series on the apocalypse and its place in Western history. Last time we focused on Revelation's role in African American culture, and now we broaden our focus to include other dimensions of American life. In the next several lectures, I want to work with a phenomenon that many people have noticed. They point out that in their experience, there seem to be basically two options when it comes to Revelation. Some Christian groups seem to be preoccupied with the book and what it might tell us about the future, and the rest don't read Revelation at all. Their experiences vary depending on which Christian groups they're familiar with. On the one hand, we find that some, though certainly not all of the evangelical and Pentecostal groups, have tended toward the futuristic side. On the other hand, many of the Episcopalians, Methodists, and Presbyterians have shied away from the book, as do most Roman Catholics. So how did we get to this point? That's the issue I want to take up in the next 3 lectures. In this lecture, I'll briefly go back to colonial America, where interest in Revelation was common among Protestants. And then I want to trace what I'll call the progressive approach to the book. What I mean is that many people in the 18th and 19th centuries assumed that history was progressing toward the great millennial kingdom of God, when there would be peace and harmony on earth for 1,000 years. And they thought that they could share in this progressive march of history by helping to spread the gospel and reform society. So for a long time, the apocalyptic and progressive perspectives went together. Then, during the mid-19th century, the efforts at social reform heated up over the issue of slavery. The apocalyptic rhetoric also heated up until finally the great thunderstorm broke with the coming of the Civil War. It was after the war was over that the apocalyptic and progressive streams split apart. The moderate and liberal Protestant groups dropped their interest in Revelation, while retaining a hope for social progress. Many of the more conservative evangelical groups moved away from the hope for social progress, but they hung on to Revelation, which they thought had a place in evangelism, and we're still feeling the effects of that split today. So this lecture will follow the groups that thought history was moving forward progressively and see how they later lost interest in Revelation. Then in the next 2 lectures, I'll look at the groups that hung on to Revelation because they expected God to intervene dramatically in history in the near future. So let me begin tracing this progressive line of thought with Jonathan Edwards, who was the leading American theologian of the mid-1700s. Edwards was educated at Yale and later became president of the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. And he combined the life of the Spirit with the life of the mind. On the spiritual side, he was deeply involved in the religious awakenings that swept through New England at that time. And on the intellectual side, he produced extensive treatises on scripture, theology, and the psychology of religion. It's also significant that Edwards was fascinated by the apocalypse and kept notes on it throughout his life. Edwards' view of history was deeply theological, and he sometimes summed it up in the language taken from the Apocalypse, which referred to God as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. For Edwards, all things ultimately came from God and were moving back to God. He understood that all things were created good. He thought of the creation as the extension of God's goodness into space, and of history as the extension of God's goodness into time. Yet he recognized that both creation and history were marred by human sin. So Edwards insisted that God had determined to work out his purposes providentially in order to restore all things to their proper state at the end of time. Revelation was helpful here because its vision culminated in creation itself being made new. You can picture the process as a great circle, in which history begins with God, then makes a great single rotation so that it ends where it began, with God. Edwards read the Apocalypse itself as an outline of God's activity in history. He thought the book outlined all of history from the time of Christ to the end of the present age. And along the way, each vision symbolized a particular era of history. The visions in the Apocalypse begin with the early church and culminate in the millennium, which is then followed by the new creation and eternity. If all this sounds familiar to you, it should be by now. Earlier in the course, we found that some of the medieval interpreters had turned Revelation into a map of history, and this idea was also used by Luther at one point. By the time we get to Edwards, this approach was very common among biblical interpreters. In fact, you may recall from my first lecture that this was the perspective of Sir Isaac Newton, who thought that Revelation had predicted everything from the rise of Constantine in the 4th century to the fall of Constantinople in the 15th. And Edwards was doing the same thing. He even knew about some of Newton's work. Edwards thought that in the grand scheme of things, time had progressed through all of Revelation up to the visions in chapter 16. That chapter pictures angels pouring out bowls of wrath on the beast and his kingdom. Edwards interpreted that vision symbolically and thought that pouring out the bowl signified an outpouring of spiritual power on earth. And he thought this spiritual power both brought people to true faith and overcame the deceptive forces of the beast or Antichrist. Like most Protestants of that time, Edwards thought that the Antichrist was the papacy. In his eyes, the papacy had usurped the truth of Christianity by insisting on the Pope's supreme authority to determine who was and wasn't in the church, by persecuting those who called for reform, by giving attention to holy objects, and by encouraging pomp and display in worship. So when Edwards read Revelation as a map of history, he thought the actions taken against the kingdom of the beast in chapter 16 were about the times in which he was living. He thought that the 5th angel who plunged the kingdom of the beast into darkness symbolized the Protestant Reformation. And time had now advanced to the 6th angel who poured out a bowl that dried up the water of the Euphrates River. That action prepared for the final defeat of the beast. Edwards again read the vision symbolically as an outpouring of spiritual power in the Protestant churches. He thought that the vision of the Euphrates drying up signified the drying up of the papacy's sources of income. And he looked for evidence of this in everything from political changes in Spain to English victories over the Catholic French. All of these seemed to be signs that the temporal power of the papacy was being weakened in preparation for the establishment of Christ's true kingdom on earth. Edwards also shared the older idea that history was moving toward the millennial age. He shared the tradition of the early church, which envisioned the millennium as the final period of peace on earth before the dawn of the new creation and the onset of eternity. Edwards spoke of the coming millennial age in glowing terms as the time when God would be glorified by people everywhere and the world would be unspeakably happy. That's when the wolf and the lamb would feed together. Edwards expected knowledge and holiness to fill the earth. He thought that the divisions in the church would cease and there would be only truth, love, and harmony. The entire human family would be united and there would be health and long life for all. For Edwards, this vision defines the goal of God's work in the world. Edwards didn't think that human beings could achieve the ideal by their own efforts. He assumed it would come through the power of God, which renewed people spiritually. But through this process of renewal, He expected God to transform society as a whole. Given this worldview, it was natural for Edwards to wonder just how much longer it would take for the millennium to arrive. And his general sense was that it would probably be sometime after the year 2000. He thought that just as the Antichrist's kingdom rose gradually, it would fall gradually. And he assumed that it would probably take 250 years for the spiritual condition of humanity to advance to true millennial quality. So, by Edwards' reckoning, the millennial age should have arrived by now. For those of us now living after the year 2000, it probably seems that Edwards was overly optimistic in his hope for progress toward universal peace and harmony. At least my own reading of recent history suggests that we've not yet reached the point where the world can be called unspeakably happy. So I need to think about what to make of Edwards' approach. From our vantage point, it's easy to see that in many respects this approach was misguided. It's problematic to turn the apocalypse into a timeline, which can be directly connected to specific events in history. That's regularly proven to be unworkable. Moreover, his hostile comments about Catholicism will rightly seem troubling to many. But the aspect of Edwards' approach that proved to be so influential was actually its progressive outlook. Although Edwards insisted that God alone could create the truly peaceful and happy society, he assumed that when people knew that, they would want to direct their own efforts toward that end. So that sense that things were moving towards an ultimate goal gave people a strong sense of purpose. Their work was part of God's overall design for the world, and therefore it ultimately had value and meaning. Now for Edwards, the immediate focus was on the spiritual renewal of individuals and communities. But since the millennium included the general expansion of knowledge, he could also celebrate and encourage the advances that were being made in science by people like Sir Isaac Newton. Those who followed Edwards' basic approach kept expanding their sense of progress toward the millennium until it included advances in technology and commerce, in medicine and communication. Since all of these helped to raise the overall standard of living, people could say that they helped to bring the millennial ideal closer. Although the idea of this 1,000-year period originally came from Revelation chapter 20, you can see how the concept grew and grew until it took on a life of its own. Edwards also thought that God was the one who set the pace of history leading up to the millennium. But people in the 19th century got impatient and thought they could speed things up by working a little harder to make society better. After all, if people were able to speed up travel by inventing steamboats and railroads, why not speed up history itself by reforming American society? It seemed like the practical thing to do. Perhaps the best example of someone who wanted to get to the millennial age in a hurry was Charles Finney. Finney started out as a lawyer, but he had a dramatic conversion experience and went on to become one of the most famous evangelists of the early 19th century. Finney was not going to wait around looking for signs of spiritual renewal. He set out to make it happen. He developed strategies for the large evangelistic gatherings that featured hard-hitting preaching and calls for people to undergo a true spiritual conversion. Many people were disturbed by Finney's high-pressure tactics, but others thought that his success in getting people by the thousands to commit themselves to Christian faith showed that the millennium was about to arrive. What's important to note is that Finney connected his efforts at evangelism to his efforts at social reform. From Finney's perspective, the millennial hope involved peace and prosperity for all people. Therefore, if that hope was to be achieved, it was not enough to focus on spiritual renewal alone. Society itself needed to be changed. One aspect of his program was controlling alcohol abuse, and another was the abolition of slavery. Finney became president of Oberlin College, which in many ways was a training ground for leaders in the anti-slavery movement. The college was known for admitting both blacks and women as students, which was certainly progressive at the time. Some who studied there became speakers at the anti-slavery meetings that were held in the North. Others worked with the Underground Railroad, which was the network that helped slaves escape from the South. All this combined attention to evangelism and social reform was part of a worldview that's called post-millennialism. That specific expression sounds peculiar, I know, to the uninitiated. But what it refers to is the idea that history will gradually progress toward the millennial age. And only after the millennium, or post-millennium, will Jesus return for the resurrection and last judgment. I mention this because in lectures to come, we'll see that some people objected to this gradual approach. They insisted that the present age would end cataclysmically with the return of Christ, and only then would the millennium arrive. But the post-millennialists insisted that God worked through social progress, not cosmic destruction, and people were to see God's work wherever efforts were being made toward the spiritual renewal of individuals and the reform of society as a whole. The efforts at social reform that we see in Finney took a more radical turn in others who were active in the movement to abolish slavery. And they had their own take on the apocalyptic visions of Revelation. Perhaps the best example of this is the journalist, William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was the editor of a newspaper called The Liberator, which called for the complete and immediate abolition of slavery in America, where others looked for ways that slavery might gradually be brought to an end. Garrison insisted that delay was unconscionable. The paper published accounts of slaves being whipped, beaten, kidnapped, and lynched. The idea was to make people see that slavery was not benign, but immoral, and that it had to be ended immediately. In addition to the paper, Garrison co-founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, which worked for abolition. For people like Garrison, Revelation's descriptions of the beast and Babylon didn't pertain to the papacy, as so many Protestants had charged. From his perspective, it was the United States that was Babylon. And the reason was that its vast economic system relied on the practice of human slavery. Where people were in bondage, there the beast was active. This perspective takes up aspects of the description of Babylon in Revelation 18. You may remember from our study of that passage that it depicts imperial Rome as a commercial power with a relentless appetite for goods. It gives a lengthy list that includes the empire's desire for gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, for cloth and carriages, grain and livestock. And at the end of the list, Revelation points to Babylon's appetite for slaves and the souls of men. That line caught the attention of the abolitionists. They charged that it was their own country that had been turned into Babylon by making it a place where human beings could be bought and sold. So they latched onto a phrase that was used in that same section of Revelation. That part of the book warned that this oppressive commercial Babylon would soon be destroyed. And chapter 18, verse 4 says, "Come out of her, my people, that ye not be partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." The key words are, "Come out of her, my people." That was a call to disengage from the economic practices associated with Babylon. A similar theme appears in 2 Corinthians, which also calls people to come out or separate themselves from a sinful society. So it was the name that was given to the most radical wing of the abolitionist movement. They were the come-outers because they insisted that they had to leave the churches and other institutions that condoned slavery. The rhetorical force of equating the United States with Babylon can be seen in a letter that Garrison wrote in 1857. It was the year of a devastating collapse in the American economy. It was bringing financial ruin to many, but Garrison declared that this was a sign of God's judgment on the country. For him, the bowls full of plagues described in Revelation were falling on the United States, which fulfilled the role of Babylon. Garrison wove in the images from Revelation 16 when he said, "From a dizzy height of prosperity, which seemed to rest on an indestructible basis, the nation has been instantaneously hurled into an abyss of bankruptcy, suffering, and ruin, as though the seventh angel had poured out his vial into the air, and great Babylon had come in remembrance before God to give unto her the wine cup of the fierceness of his wrath." Garrison said that disaster was fitting for a country that made a place for slavery in its very constitution. He therefore urged people to do what Revelation 18 said, "And come out of her, my people." Now, at this point in his career, he not only meant that people were to come out of the churches that accepted slavery. He argued that the free states of the North should separate from the slave states of the South. For Garrison, the acceptance of slavery was the mark of the beast. It was a sign of submission to those who practiced slavery for the sake of economic gain. And Garrison declared that he wouldn't condone it. So his letter concluded by arguing that it would be better for the North to leave the Union than to continue within it if that meant accepting human slavery. Several years later, it ended up that the Southern states were the ones who pulled away from the Union, leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War. This is the thunderclap I mentioned earlier. It's the point where social and political conflicts reached the breaking point. And during the Civil War, the imagery of Revelation came to play a new role. It now called people to take part in the struggle. The most important and influential way this happened was, again, through music. I'm referring to the song called the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The opening verse of the Battle Hymn is essentially a musical rendition of scenes from Revelation in which Christ returns to trample the winepress of the wrath of God. So let me tell you how the song originated, and then let me comment on what it does. The song was written by a woman named Julia Ward Howe, who was active in the movement to abolish slavery. It was the first year of the war, 1861, and she was in Washington, D.C., where the Union armies were being assembled. She and some others took a short ride outside the city to see a review of Union troops there. At that time, there was an artillery skirmish nearby, and as she and others made her way back to the city, later in the day, she heard the troops singing the song, "John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave." Someone suggested that Julia should compose different lyrics for it. The next day, she awoke before dawn and began to write. The result was a song that blended images from the Bible with those of her own experience. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." She published her poem in the Atlantic Monthly, and it quickly became a rallying cry for people to commit themselves to the struggle. Whenever I discuss the apocalyptic imagery in the Battle Hymn, I'm never quite sure what people will think. There are many who love the song because its call to commitment speaks to them so strongly. Others are put off by it because to them it sounds like triumphant nationalism. So I find it helpful to look back at the primary text on which the song is based, which is Revelation 19. That chapter of Revelation depicts the coming of the Lord to trample the great winepress of wrath. In that vision, the warrior is Christ, who suffered to redeem people. He's called faithful and true, and Revelation says that he makes war with justice. You may remember from our study of that passage that the only weapon used is the sword that comes from the mouth of Christ. In Revelation, his terrible, swift sword is his word, and that's what wins the battle. So in Revelation, the scene points to the victory of truth, and in the song, it's truth that goes marching on. The battle hymn uses images from Revelation in a way that calls people to commit themselves to what's good and just and true. Some identify the song with military conflicts, since that was the context in which the battle hymn was written, and it's certainly been used in wartime since then. But the imagery has also functioned more widely, and it's helpful to know that. Julia Ward Howe kept singing the song after the war as she worked to obtain greater rights for women. People during the civil rights movement of the 1960s sang the song as they called for greater equality for all Americans. The song's militant imagery functions as a powerful call to engagement, and it functions best when it's linked to Revelation itself, where the sword is the word of truth. For in God's battle for justice, it's finally truth itself that must carry the day. After the Civil War was over, the apocalyptic and progressive impulses that had been linked for so long finally came apart. Apocalyptic rhetoric no longer seemed plausible. The country had been through a cataclysmic conflict, and some things had changed. Slavery was gone, but things still seemed far removed from the millennial ideal. What's more, even the notion of the millennium lost much of its appeal. It was based on a passage from Revelation, but people in many of the mainline Protestant churches were moving away from the idea that Revelation offered an outline of history that would culminate in a 1,000-year period of peace. Instead, those churches began favoring the newer types of biblical interpretation that had been developed in Europe in the 19th century. The newer perspective was to read the Bible historically and to ask what texts meant in their original context. That was seen as a definite form of progress in biblical interpretation. And of course, that perspective informed what I did earlier in this series of lectures. But when this approach was first adopted, it moved people away from the idea that Revelation predicted the course of human history down to the end of the age. And it made people see that the apocalypse was similar to other ancient apocalypses. These included texts like First Enoch, which didn't even appear in the Bible. And the negative side effect of that was that it made Revelation itself seem more marginal. Many also made a sharp contrast between the Hebrew prophets and the apocalyptic writings, which is something I did not do. But when that approach was adopted, it had long-term consequences. The Hebrew prophets were valued because they seemed to call for greater efforts to achieve a just society in this world. And at the same time, the apocalyptic writings fell out of favor because they were thought to be preoccupied with cosmic catastrophe and salvation in the age to come. And to many modern readers, the visions about dragons and beasts seemed like embarrassing holdovers from an outmoded worldview. But as people let go of the apocalyptic dimension, many hung on to their hope for the progressive improvement of the church and society. They found ample biblical grounding for their work in the words of the prophets and the teachings of Jesus, which spoke about attending to those in need. They also thought of the kingdom of God as something that was now in process. They could see the kingdom coming wherever the Christian community was growing and work was being done to improve people's lives. They saw no need for direct supernatural intervention. It's also interesting that this perspective had no real sense of closure. The future was open and would remain open. So this made Revelation suspect because it spoke of the end of things, of a final victory over evil, of the dawn of a new creation. And for some, that seemed to limit possibilities. The legacy of this progressive sense of God's work in history has been very positive in many ways. It's encouraged people to work for renewal in the Christian community and for reforms within society. But many have also noted that it seemed to have less room for the transcendent and less space for the hope that good would win out over evil in any definitive way. So in the next 2 lectures, I want to focus on some of the groups that moved in the opposite direction. The groups that have expected the future to come with cataclysmic force. And once we've done that and seen the problems on that side, I'll need to devote the final lecture to the question, where do we go from here? I hope that you'll join me.